The world is shaped by geography, but it is also shaped by the alliances that nations build upon that geography. One of the most powerful and enduring of these is NATO. The letters stand for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was born from the ashes of the Second World War, a time when Europe was weak, divided and afraid. The Soviet Union, a vast power stretching across Eurasia, had its armies in the heart of the continent. The nations of Western Europe looked across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States for protection. They needed a promise, a formal guarantee that an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. This fear of Soviet expansion was the glue that brought them together. So, on April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C., 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty. These founding members included the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, and several other Western European nations. Their geography dictated their shared interests. They were mostly democracies, mostly capitalist, and they all bordered the North Atlantic. They saw the world differently from the communist Soviet Union. The treaty was a line drawn on the map, not with ink, but with a military promise. It was a clear message to Moscow: do not cross this line. The Cold War had begun, and NATO was the West's primary military shield. The organization was from its very beginning a military alliance. Its purpose was not trade or cultural exchange, but collective defense. It was designed to keep the peace through strength. The idea was simple but powerful: deterrence. If the Soviet Union knew that attacking a small country like Belgium would mean war with the mighty United States, it would think twice. This concept of shared risk and shared security was revolutionary. It bound the fate of North America with the fate of Western Europe. The Atlantic was no longer a barrier separating them, it was a bridge connecting their security. Over the decades, the world changed, but NATO remained. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and the Cold War ended. Many people wondered if NATO still had a purpose, but instead of disappearing, it grew. Former members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led military alliance, began to join. Countries like Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic, which had once been under Moscow's control, now looked to the West for their security. They remembered their history and their geography, and they chose to align themselves with the democratic nations of NATO, seeking protection under its powerful umbrella. This expansion would become a major point of contention for a resurgent Russia. The core of the North Atlantic Treaty is a single, powerful clause, Article 5. This is the principle of collective defense, the very heart of the alliance. It states that an armed attack against one or more members in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. This is not just a polite agreement, it is a solemn vow. If one member is invaded, the other 31 members are obligated to come to its aid. This could mean sending troops, providing weapons, or taking other military actions. It is the ultimate insurance policy for a nation-state. This promise is what makes NATO the most formidable military alliance in history. The list of members has grown significantly since 1949. Today, there are 32 member countries. They stretch from North America with the United States and Canada across the Atlantic to Europe. Key European members include the United Kingdom, France and Germany, the continent's major economic and military powers. But the alliance also includes countries like Italy, Spain, Turkey and Poland. More recently, nations bordering Russia or in its historical sphere of influence have joined, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and, most recently, Finland and Sweden. Each new member extends the line of defense, bringing more territory, more soldiers and more resources into the pact. To make this promise of protection real, NATO conducts regular military exercises. These are large-scale training events where soldiers, sailors and Air Force personnel from different member countries practice working together. They learn to use the same procedures, communicate effectively and coordinate complex operations. This ensures that if a crisis ever occurs, their forces can merge into a single, effective fighting machine. NATO also has permanent military forces such as standing naval groups and a rapid response force that can be deployed anywhere in the world on short notice. It is a constant display of readiness and capability. The only time Article 5 has ever been invoked was after the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001. Though the attack came not from a state but from a terrorist group, NATO allies stood with America. They sent planes to help patrol the skies over the United States and later joined the mission in Afghanistan to hunt down those responsible. This showed that the commitment was real, even when facing a new kind of threat. The alliance adapted, proving that its core principle of mutual defense could be applied to the challenges of the 21st century, not just the Cold War fears of the 20th. For the leaders in Moscow, the story of NATO looks very different. They do not see a defensive alliance, they see a hostile military bloc that has been marching steadily eastward, right up to Russia's borders. From the Russian perspective, the end of the Cold War should have meant the end of NATO. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved, the Soviet Union was gone. So why did the opposing alliance not only survive, but expand? This question is central to understanding Russia's deep-seated wariness. They feel that promises made by Western leaders in the 1990s about not expanding the alliance eastward were broken. This feeling of betrayal is rooted in recent history and geography. When countries like Poland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania joined NATO, the alliance's military infrastructure moved hundreds of miles closer to Russia's key cities, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. Imagine a rival military power setting up bases next door to your home. You would naturally feel threatened. Russia sees NATO's missile defense systems, military bases and troop rotations in Eastern Europe as a direct threat to its national security. They view it as an attempt to contain and weaken Russia, to limit its influence in its own neighborhood. The expansion into former Soviet republics is particularly sensitive. Countries like Ukraine and Georgia seeking NATO membership is a red line for Moscow. Russia sees these countries as part of its historical sphere of influence, a buffer zone that is crucial for its defense. The geography is unforgiving. The North European plain offers no natural barriers to an invading army from the west. This historical vulnerability, exploited by Napoleon and Hitler, is burned into the Russian psyche. A NATO-allied Ukraine, with a long shared border, is viewed from the Kremlin as an existential threat that must be stopped at all costs. Furthermore, Russia points to NATO's military interventions as evidence of its aggressive nature. The NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, done without a United Nations Security Council resolution, is often cited by Moscow as an example of the alliance acting as a global policeman, ignoring international law when it suits its interests. The intervention in Libya in 2011 is another example they use. From Russia's viewpoint, these actions prove that NATO is not purely defensive. They believe it is a tool for the United States and its allies to impose their will on other countries, and that Russia could one day be a target. We are left with two very different stories, both of which are true to the people who tell them. On one side, NATO and its members, particularly those in Eastern Europe, see the alliance as a guarantee of their freedom and sovereignty. For countries like Poland or the Baltic states, their history is one of domination by their larger neighbor to the east. Joining NATO was not an act of aggression against Russia, it was an act of self-preservation. It was a choice to align with a community of democracies that promised to protect their right to exist as independent nations. They chose their own destiny. From this perspective, NATO does not force any country to join. Nations apply for membership because they see it as being in their best interest. The alliance argues that its open-door policy is a fundamental principle. Any European democracy that can contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area should be able to seek membership. To deny them this right, they argue, would be to grant Russia a veto over the sovereign decisions of its neighbors. It would be accepting the idea of a sphere of influence, which they believe belongs to a darker imperial past. They see NATO as a protector of small nations, not a threat. However, seen from Moscow, every argument for NATO's defensive nature is dismissed. Russia perceives a relentless pattern of encirclement. They see the West's rhetoric about democracy and freedom as a smokescreen for the cold, hard reality of geopolitics and military power. When NATO places troops and missiles in Romania or Poland, Russia does not hear reassurances. It hears the echoes of past invasions and sees a direct challenge to its security. This deep mistrust fuels a cycle of action and reaction, where a NATO military exercise is seen as a threat, prompting a Russian military buildup, which in turn convinces NATO it needs to strengthen its defenses. In conclusion, the tension between NATO and Russia is a classic security dilemma shaped by geography, history, and deeply conflicting perspectives. NATO sees itself as a defensive alliance of sovereign democracies, expanding only because free countries choose to join for their own protection. Russia sees a hostile military bloc breaking past promises and advancing on its borders, threatening its very existence. There is little room for compromise when both sides believe they are acting defensively to secure their future. The reality on the ground, on this day in 2025, is a Europe more divided and militarized than at any time since the Cold War, a direct consequence of these irreconcilable views.